I am really, really glad that I get to chair this panel, although there are kind of bookmark panels here today. What it was like then, although this panel is both about what was like then and what it's like now. And then later in the day, we're going to have what it's like now with perhaps, shall I say, a different generation of people. But for me, this is just really a special panel because everybody on it, we all, in two cases, really directly, and in one case, indirectly, go back way into the Cold War.
Way into the Cold War.
Way into the Cold War. So I'm just, a couple of things I have to say that I knew of Tom Kent shortly after his assignment to Moscow in 1976, because my husband, or the man who would become my husband, was a refusnik, and he met Tom, and Tom, they hung out together. And because he called the Associated Press Bureau to tell Tom that he had gotten his exit visa, do you remember this story?
No.
You don't know this story? You were on home leave when he finally got his visa, and George Krinsky took the message and sent it out as a news release. And he was expelled from the Soviet Union a week later. I told Luke Harding that story yesterday.
Krinsky, not me.
No, not you. No, Krinsky was expelled. Okay. Jonathan, actually, we met here. And in fact, Jonathan, in the years when Tom had already cut his teeth in Moscow, was assistant director of the Harriman Institute. That I noticed is not directly in your bio, but
who knows what's there?
Head of the TV
fiction?
Project, I suppose that's all true. But although Rose and I didn't meet until more recently, I feel like we've had connections of many sorts that go back about that far, so I'm really glad that she's here. And I do want to add one thing to, I hope she doesn't mind, to her bio, which is she is the only American I know who has written a dissertation in Russian and defended it in Russian at St. Petersburg State University. And 2 years ago?
No, more than that, 4 years ago.
It was 4 years ago, okay. I mean, so I think that really should be prominently, put in there. So on that note, I think this is going to be one of the most exciting panels of the day, and we're going to change the order a bit for various reasons, partially chronological, and Tom Kent's going to go first.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be here. And yesterday's sessions were great. I was here for the morning session, and the speakers did a very good job of explaining how the pervasive climate of fear that existed in Soviet times is not there, at least so much these days, how there's a whole generation now that does not know anything about Soviet power. Yet, at the same time, I guess we have to keep in mind that every country is to some degree the product of its past. And the effect of 70 years of Soviet power doesn't disappear overnight and doesn't disappear even in a generation. So in talking today about the Soviet press of the Cold War period and drawing some connections to the Russian press of today, I want to talk about what similarities there are, what the modern-day Russian press has perhaps internalized a bit from the Soviet period, and what in Russian journalism today is truly new. And since not everyone here is 100 years old, I will recap briefly some of the aspects of the Soviet press. We're talking about the era of Pravda and Izvestia, not the latter-day versions of those papers that have appeared from time to time, but the real Pravda and Izvestia of the back in the day, the 6-page, 8-page versions of 6-page or 8-page editions that those newspapers put out with a little 6-digit Glavlit censorship code on the back indicating that it had been approved by the official censors. The days of Gosteleradio, one organization, one government organization that controlled all broadcasting in the Soviet Union, and of course the official TASS news agency that linked all of the Soviet news media. And clearly there was a very tight relationship between the Soviet regime and the Soviet press. Lenin himself considered himself above all a journalist. That's what he said on his identification card. It said, you know, journaliste is his profession. And he said, in the great famous quote from Lenin on the press, he said that the Soviet press is not only an agitator and propagandist, but a collective organizer of the people. The press was owned by the government and the party and so-called public organizations under party control. They completely controlled any access to printing presses. They even controlled access to photocopying machines. The press at the time was not a fourth estate. It was not an independent force. The essence of journalism was really partinost, the degree to which journalism operated in support of the party, advancing the party line and changing society for the better, they hoped. Soviets would mock the Western press as a so-called depot of ideas, as they call it, just a place where different ideas are sort of stuck here and there without any particular coherence. And they felt that if the Soviet press ever became similarly uncontrolled, that could easily lead to public confusion, anarchy, and the return of the capitalist system. Now, none of this had anything to do, of course, with, as we say, covering the news. Fires, disasters, riots, medical crises involving Soviet leaders, all of this passed without mention in the Soviet press, meaning that reporters at the time had to basically try to gather this information themselves, which is very difficult in a huge country. Now and then there would be one of these rumors that Brezhnev had died. We would call up the Kremlin if one of our someone in our office had the courage to do so. We would call up the Kremlin and ask for Mr. Brezhnev's office and say, you know, are we here? You know, there might be some kind of a health issue. Is he okay? And they would say something like, well, with rumors like that, he'll live 100 years, which we took to be confirmation that he was alive. But you could do this 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. You know, if the rumor broke on, you know, Saturday night, there was really no way to confirm anything like this. Now and then, if the press was obligated to report something that was really bad, for example, there was a case once where a big airplane crashed with about half the Soviet general staff on it, and they felt that there was some need to say something. Then one paper, usually Pravda, would have a little box on its last page, about a 1-inch box on the back page, headlined "Proishestvia," event. And they would say, well, a plane had an accident and carrying important members of the military, and there were casualties. And that was all the coverage you would get. And all of this was reflected very much in Soviet newsrooms at the time. I mean, I use newsroom in the modern sense. Newsroom in the Soviet sense was a long corridor with little offices off to each side where journalists sat there writing, usually in longhand, articles that would then be transcribed by secretaries and so forth. There was no sense of a modern newsroom with people running around and phones ringing, because that all implies urgency and immediacy, and that was just not the theme of the Soviet press. So basically, the Soviet press was there to report on or create good news. The only fly in the ointment was that, unfortunately, this press had to serve not only to organize and agitate and propagandize the people, but it also had to function as a form of esoteric communication with the 18 million members of the Communist Party. Things being what they were in Soviet times, you couldn't give the 18 million members of the Communist Party a log-on where they could go to an internet site and get the real story. They had to get the real story somehow out of the newspaper, at the same time that to the ordinary reader, the newspaper had to look like it was all full of good news. So this gave rise to a whole school of diagonal writing that the ordinary reader might not note, but the people who knew what to look for would. And this included things like Pravda editorials that would inevitably start with a headline like, you know, Dorogoi uspiecha na blaga naroda, along the road of success for the good of the people. And it would say, you know, oh, livestock raising is really great these days, and we have all this livestock and more meat and more. And then inevitably, in the middle of the editorial, there would be a paragraph that started, "Однако," however. And it would say, however, not at every farm as the livestock sheltered the way it should be. Sometimes, there are leaks in the roof and so forth. That'd be one paragraph. And then the rest of the editorial would be how wonderful everything is. So the people, whose job it was to know, the party livestock officials in far-flung regions would say, okay, there's a campaign on to fix these barns and we'd better. But otherwise, casual reader, you wouldn't know. Same thing with whenever the party line had to change. And this is a problem since, in principle, the party line should never have to change because the Communist Party was simply carrying out a historical inevitability. So they would know how history was developing. But now and then, they had to change policy. And when they did, this would be introduced usually in the Soviet press with "как известно," as is known, which is usually for anything with total change in policy. They would say, as is known, the Soviet Union has always stood for compromise with the United States on certain questions of nuclear arms. Aha! So this was the Soviet announcement that they were changing policy and going to negotiate. There is also not surprisingly, a great obsession with security. The Soviet press scrubbed of anything that might be moderately useful to any kind of foreign intelligence agency or military organization, such that some of these productions became really satires of themselves. And my favorite was always a radio program called Polyevaya Pochta, or Mail Call. It was a program about Soviet soldiers serving in different places and all the things they were doing. And it would say, for example, Vadim Ivanov writes to his mother that he's having a wonderful time and doing great things. He is carrying out important duties at a certain location. So there you go. In terms of exposés, well, there were exposés sort of in Soviet style. A typical example of an exposé in the press might be that that at the shoe repair kiosk outside the Kursk railway station, the glue isn't that good. So if you get your heels repaired and it rains, the heels could fall off. Well, there you are, the press at work. And the other thing, of course, which was very important to us correspondents at the time, was Literaturная Gazeta, which came out every Wednesday, which would give us each week sort of a scandal on a silver platter. Like, it's hard for young people to find places to meet, or it's hard to find a good husband these days. And we were so grateful, we lapped this stuff up because it was the only inside slight admission that maybe everything wasn't totally perfect. As for journalists themselves in the profession, there was a constant tug of war during the Soviet period between professional journalists and amateur journalists, I guess you'd say. Under Lenin and under Stalin, there was a great movement of worker-peasant correspondents, рабочие сельские корреспонденты, the Rabsel Corps as they were called. And these were sort of amateurs with working from the idea, and you hear this now sometimes too in modern journalism, that you don't need professional journalists and anybody can write about the experiences of their life. So Rabsel Corps were very important. After the Khrushchev period, starring Alexei Adjubey, the son-in-law of Khrushchev, who was the editor of Izvestia, they started to put more emphasis on the professionalization of the press and making reporters feel they had a certain professional responsibility to the truth, at least to some degree, and that certain professional skills were required. And a lot was done to try to raise the prestige of the profession. They even had a journalist song, «Правде жизни вернее во всем, этой правды не гасимый свет, от своих блокнотов донесем, до потомков через толщу лет». So anyhow, the idea being that out of our notebooks come the truth that we convey to future generations. So today, obviously, a lot of the Soviet era barriers to entry in journalism have come down. There is anybody can start a newspaper, pretty much. Anybody can start a blog. Other big changes. You don't have this pervasive climate of security, at least that the that the press is involved in.
It's not why they try and arrest me every other day.
In 2000, for example, the Russian submarine, the Kursk, was lost. At the time, the authorities were announcing that actually the crew was okay, oxygen was being pumped in, but the press was free enough to report the truth, which was oxygen was not being pumped in, and in fact the whole crew died. During the terrorist event at the Nordost Theater performance at Taganska Square in Moscow in 2000, there was a lot of press coverage of the movement of security forces toward the theater in order to try to rescue the hostages. Everyone acknowledged, even the press after that perhaps the press had taken a little too much liberty with reporting security information that actually had been useful perhaps to the hostage takers. So there's much more now in terms of exposés of serious things, although Alexei Simonov of the Glasnost Defense Fund says that in Russia there's now freedom of speech, but nothing gets heard. In other words, you're free to do exposés in the paper, but nothing necessarily happens.
Sounds
You can
like
you can show malfeasance, but the prosecutors may not act at all. But there remains a nexus between politics and the press. Some organs, as we know, are owned or controlled by political groups and oligarchs, government, and so forth. And the government still considers some controls to be necessary. And sometimes they speak of this in fairly Soviet language. In November 2003, there was an article in Rossiyskaya Gazeta by Vitaly Tretyakov, who said, "Freedom of speech is not one of the top priorities of the human race, but just one of the cornerstones of the contemporary market democratic political system." He said, "Freedom of the press and pluralism of opinion can lead to the disintegration of society and the state. Freedom of the press is in fact freedom of speech for journalists, not all citizens in a given society, and freedom of the press is in some sense a restriction on freedom of speech for the remaining citizens in a given society." He said, "The main television channels in Russia are political nuclear weapons, and Russia's central political leadership has made a decision to keep control over political nuclear weapons." Now, these days, of course, there can be publications and blogs run by opposition groups, and we may be on the brink of seeing more of them, but the question is, will they be agitators and propagandists and organizers against those in power, or in the tradition of the press being for political purposes, or simply reporters of the news? And it's not clear that everyone simply wants the news to be reported as it is. The latest poll I've seen is a Romir poll in 2004 that found that 76% of Russians consider censorship to be necessary. Alexei Simonov of the Glasnost Defense Fund says that a lot of Russians seem to feel that it's really peculiar for newspapers to do exposés. If the newspaper discovers that someone is embezzling money, a public official, why wouldn't they just go to the prosecutors and tell the prosecutors, and the prosecutor will go and arrest them? Why make a public spectacle of it? Why embarrass everyone? Why make a scene? It's like when there was a fire once in Moscow. I was taking photos of it, and a woman came up to me and said, "Of all the beautiful buildings on this street, why are you taking a picture only of the one that's on fire?" So there's a feeling that you want to maintain some kind of dignity. Why do we have to have all this horrible stuff in front of us? Last year I was moderating a panel on ethics at the Russian State Humanities University in Moscow. And there were quite a number of young Russian journalism students. We're not talking about, old sharks of Soviet journalism. We're talking about young Russian journalism students who also felt that censorship was appropriate. There had been shortly before a riot at the Manege in Moscow where a lot of, skinhead types more or less had attacked a lot of people from the Caucasus, sort of a ethnic riot. And a number of these young students said they think that probably should not have been in the press. All it does is make things look bad and inspires people to become violent themselves, and it's best kept quiet. So I'm going to stop there, look forward to the discussion, and I promise not to sing again.
I like the singing.
Yes, the singing was a high point, but of many high
Wait till we
points.
do the dance video.
So I'm gonna risk throwing in an anecdote that in the summer of '71 on Nevsky Prospect, Slav and I had managed to find a taxi, which was already, strange, but there was this enormous crowd in front of Kazansky Sabor. And I'm going, and Slav and the taxi driver are going, oh, we better go out and find out what happened. And I'm going, no, you can just read about it in the news tomorrow. I mean, I was a sophomore in college. And they looked at me like, what planet did you fall from? So also the, acceptance that there was going to be no news in the press the next day. And if you wanted to find out, you better find out for yourself. Anyway, I'm going to then pass this on to Rose Brady, who's going to speak next.
Okay, thank you very much. I also want to thank the Harriman Institute and the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I thought yesterday was fascinating and I learned a lot. Before I start, I don't know if anybody minds this, but I was wondering if I could just find out how many people who are here today were here yesterday? Okay. And how many people are ex-Soviet citizens? Okay. Just wondering. Some of my comments will bear a slight resemblance to what Ann Cooper said yesterday if you were here for the first session, because we overlapped, but I had a very different focus from her. I had the privilege of covering the end of the Cold War for the U.S. business and economic magazine, Business Week, now known as Bloomberg Business Week. I arrived in Moscow in August 1989 and stayed as bureau chief until the summer of 1993. But I've gone back and forth a fair amount since then. In the second half of the 90s, I was working on a book on the Russian economy. And as Kathy mentioned, in the 2000s, I was working on a dissertation for St. Petersburg State University in their political science and international journalism faculty. And my last time was way back in 2009 to be in Moscow. So I'm not as up on the current Russian journalism, but I hope people in the audience can help us out. Because I was asked to speak not only about my experience covering the end of the Cold War, but also whether the Cold War's past still influences media coverage in the US and Russia today, and finally to comment a little bit on the challenges facing the media in both countries today. To prepare for this presentation, I decided to go back and look at the diary I kept, not every day, but from time to time while I was in the Soviet Union, which I haven't looked at in 20 years. And when I look back at it, what struck me is how uncertain and confusing the whole unfolding story was. I'll just give you 3 examples. As early as September 1989, I wrote, "It is hard to avoid the feeling that things are unraveling here in the Soviet Union, considering the strikes, the rise in crime, and the nationalist unrest." Of course, a lot happened in 1990, but I'm going to skip forward to 91. On January 20th, 1991, I wrote, "For the first time here, and perhaps for the first time in my life, I feel that I am living in the midst of something evil that is about to take place or is already taking place." This was after the events in the Baltics when Soviet tanks and troops attacked civilians at the TV tower in Vilnius and killed 14. And of course, it was still several months before the coup, the August 1991 coup, which helped speed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Finally, after the 3-day August coup, the pace of events was so quick that in September 4th, 1991, I wrote, "I find it incredibly difficult to analyze the political situation here." So yesterday we heard from Steve Cohen, and he had a lot of criticism for us journalists and how we presented the Soviet Union. Yesterday he focused on post-92, but he also didn't really like the way journalists presented it before that, as far as I recall. And I just wanted to point out that people were trying to figure it out, and it wasn't that easy. We wrote about politics for Business Week. We wrote about the warming US-Soviet relations and the incredible decision, as it seemed, that Gorbachev let Eastern Europe go its own way I can remember, I'm sure Jonathan remembers this, that Gerasimov, the Soviet Foreign Ministry spokesman at the time, called it the Sinatra Doctrine.
Right.
Tom, do you want to hum a few bars? You know, I did it my way. I'm not going to sing, but... and we wrote about the popular demonstrations. The first one that really surprised me was in February 1990. It was just before a Central Committee plenum that did away with the monopoly on the Communist Party's power, or the Communist Party's monopoly on power, and about 100,000 people took to the streets. I like to go to those demos, both the pro-democracy and the pro-communist demos, and what always surprised me is that people were willing to talk to you and to even give their names. I mean, even the ones that were holding up signs saying "Yankee, go home" and stuff like that. But even though we wrote about politics, the main focus for Business Week was the economy. The politics provided the backdrop for Business Week to the economic story, and we looked at the political story mainly through an economic prism. We focused on the fact that Gorbachev was trying to shift foreign and domestic policy in an effort to strengthen the economy as the key to security. And Business Week framed the economic story, not all the time, but often as a reform story. What steps were being taken to try to solve the problems of the Soviet economy, the budget deficit, the debt, all the things that anybody who looked at that period or lived through that period remember, the really weak ruble, the slow growth, the shortages, all that stuff. What opposition did he face? What did the people really want? It was a time of shortages, as you recall, lines, strikes, all of that stuff. And as the economy worsened, we wrote about, and other people did too, about how and broadcast about how the various republics started to declare economic sovereignty and refused to send their funds to the center as they always had. This was a precursor, it turned out, of the declarations of independence that would follow the coup. Business Week also wrote about the early experiments in business. Back then, companies were called cooperatives. It was a more ideologically acceptable term. But these cooperatives faced constant bureaucratic hassles in trying to do their business, as did the newly established Western Soviet joint ventures, which were the first such ventures since about the 1920s that were allowed. And they fought, the partners of these ventures often fought over how to manage the company, who owned how much, and all the like. In fact, a major theme of Business Week's coverage was the battle for Soviet wealth. To me, the battle for wealth was and is intertwined with the battle for power. Leaders of the Soviet military complex back there fought very hard against changes that might shrink their factories and cut their privileges. The partners in the first US-Soviet joint venture that I was telling you about, they were Combustion Engineering, a Connecticut company that was later bought by the Swedish company ABB, and a Moscow petrochemical refinery. These guys could not get along, even though sort of both Gorbachev and Reagan signed off on their venture. But what was fun about that story is both sides separately complained bitterly to me on the record. And I wrote the whole thing out, and after I published it, they both were very mad. And it was very...
Congratulations.
It was fun.
That's what you're supposed to do. Just enough people, you're doing something wrong.
The first private businesses, the co-ops, made money by exploiting distortions in the centrally planned economy. And there were lots of distortions. I'm not going to go into details, but we can talk about it later. But in 1990, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who probably everybody remembers, later ended up going to jail and is still there, spoke to Business Week. And that was fairly early on for him. He had made his first big money through his Komsomol connections and the bank he founded with his Komsomol colleagues, Menatep. And he told me, only in the Soviet Union can you make money from air. And that's sort of how those guys made their first money. So as a Western correspondent in the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s, I found the big challenge was trying to understand the story behind the story. How much opposition really was there? What was realistically possible? And as I said at the beginning, it was rather difficult to figure out. But the great news was that people were willing to talk to you, very different from the experience that Tom had. Obviously, we read the press and learned a lot from the press, but we didn't have to be quite as guessing in what we were reading to understand what was going on. So economists, political analysts, deputies, even leading Communist Party officials were willing to talk to a business magazine like Business Week. And it was easy to talk to the entrepreneurs back there and the foreign managers involved in joint ventures. And as I mentioned earlier, even ordinary people were willing to tell their names. So to summarize, those were great years to be an economic correspondent in Moscow. And we learned from the press. We talked a little bit yesterday, and we'll probably hear this afternoon about the technology that's coming today. Back then, one of the big innovations was Interfax, which started delivering news on a very timely basis via fax after I finally got my fax. But it played an important role in the coup. So one thing that I think is a big difference between back then for journalists and now is that I never felt any fear. It's true that I didn't cover the ethnic conflicts in Azerbaijan and places like that because Business Week didn't think that that was a story for our magazine. The only times I felt fear was during the events in Lithuania, which I witnessed and which scared me quite a bit. And at 4 a.m., the second night of the August coup, when I was standing underneath the Comic-Con building, which was next to the White House, which is made of glass, and they said a column of tanks was coming. And I thought, what am I doing here? But in any case, they never came, so those were the only two times I was afraid. But if you fast forward to today, as we've already discussed a little bit yesterday, and as I'm sure we'll hear more of today, today the reporting climate in Russia is very dangerous for journalists, especially for hard-hitting journalists. We heard from the Committee to Protect Journalists yesterday more about how the independent media organizations are attacked, harassed, even killed with impunity. I wanted to clarify one point that came up yesterday. I checked the website of the CPJ, and according to the CPJ website, if I counted the names right, 13 journalists were murdered between 1993 and 1999, and 20 have been murdered since 2000. That's a pretty bad record for both periods. To me, the harassment and attacks are a reflection of desire, or maybe a reflection at least, of a desire of those who are in power, whether it's political power or financial power, to resist change. Maybe you could call it an echo of the opposition to Gorbachev's efforts at change more than 20 years ago. Obviously, Russia is very different today than the Soviet Union was 20 years ago, but as an observer from afar, I can't help but see certain echoes. For example, the battle for Russia's wealth continues. Witness the reports of Vladimir Putin's friends enriching themselves, possibly thanks to their connections to the president and involvement with state-controlled companies such as Gazprom and Rosneft, although, of course, the president denies that. And I'd love to hear what other people say about that. The huge demos the Times did a real good story on that recently. The huge demonstrations that have taken place in Moscow in the last several months can't help but remind me at least a little of the demos of 1990. And I happen to have been in China when Putin was booed at the end of November. I was working with the Chinese media partner of Business Week, and they were so fascinated to hear what was going on in Russia. But the scene of Putin being booed reminded me of the incidents they're different, of course, but in the incidents in early 90 when rank-and-file members of the Communist Party started kicking out regional leaders in Tyumen, Sverdlovsk, and places like that. So I admit these comparisons may be superficial, but to me they say that maybe the strains of the late Soviet period remain relevant today in Russia. And as we discussed and we'll discuss more, as for US-Soviet relations, there still are Cold War-type attitudes. I won't go at length, but the pressure that the McFaul, that's a Freudian slip. U.S. Ambassador Mike McFaul has come under recently as a sign of the old suspicion of America. On the American side, this is sort of an economic point, but I find it really surprising that the old Jacksonvanik Amendment, which was passed in 1974 to encourage the Soviet Union to allow Jewish immigration to the U.S., still exists. The amendment denies permanent normal trade relations to Russia, and it's an anachronism. And if it's not repealed by this summer, actually the U.S. will be penalized because this summer Russia joins the World Trade Organization, and sanctions can be made against the U.S. if it doesn't allow Russia to have the same trade relations as other nations in the World Trade Organization. That's a kind of an obscure point, but Jackson-Vanik is a symbolism that at least some members of the U.S. Congress aren't able to kind of move forward. I think the issue right now is, should something else replace it to keep the pressure on Putin on human rights? And I think that's a good thing, but they have to move on and figure out a solution to that. In spite of these tensions between the U.S. and Russia, others, are on Syria and Iran. I personally see no anti-Russian Cold War fervor in the American media. If the U.S. media report on Russian policy towards Iran or congressional attitudes towards Jackson-Vanik or in large demos in Moscow and other cities, I just think they're doing their jobs. And rather than the Cold War itself, I'd like to argue that other forces unleashed in the aftermath of the Cold War have influenced the media landscape more. I'm not going to talk about this at length. We can talk about it during the discussion if you're interested. But the two most important are technology and market economics, and these go hand in hand. Of course, the internet, blogs, social media, et cetera, have given audiences many more opportunities to receive the news, but they've also created tremendous economic pressures. That's led to a crunch in foreign reporting as bureaus have been shrunk or cut back. Those who were here yesterday saw a great presentation by Fordham's Beth Noble, another former CBS correspondent, who talked about how the American press corps in Russia has really shrunk. And actually, foreign bureaus around the world have really been cut back. At the same time, the focus of foreign coverage has changed since the end of the Cold War, naturally. But except for tumultuous moments, Russia and the ex-Soviet Union is no longer, unfortunately, a big story. We've had the ethnic conflicts in the 90s in Yugoslavia and other countries. We had 9/11, the terrorist attacks, Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a very interesting study done last year by the Pew Research Center's Project for Excellence in Journalism. And they analyzed over 52,000 stories produced by U.S. media, TV, et cetera, radio. Russia represented 0.4% of the coverage, just 0.4%. Iran was 1%, Iraq was 1.3%, and Afghanistan was 3.6%. The most important story was the U.S. economy at 13.6%. That shows you, one, Russia's small compared to the other foreign stories, but also that Americans aren't interested in that much outside their own borders right now. I'd be interested to see a similar study for the Russian media. I haven't found it yet, but maybe somebody anecdotally can talk about how much the U.S. is covered right now in the Russian media. I hope that other panelists and the audience will weigh in on how much you think Cold War attitudes remain in the Russian press. I would simply say that if Putin and his administration espouse anti-American Cold War-style views and order up articles from the Russian media for money, as Fordham's Beth Noble said yesterday, then the Cold War probably still does have an influence on the Russian media, at least indirectly through the Kremlin. At the same time, my guess is that independent media and journalists face technological and financial challenges just as the media in the U.S. does. but probably much, much more so because of all the political pressures that they face when they report, especially hard-hitting stories. This pressure can include financial raids, closures, and so on. And as we've discussed, the journalists face personal risk. So to try to answer the question that I was posed, it may be possible that the Cold War legacy in the Russian press is stronger at this particular stage than its legacy in the US media. But I'd like to hear what other people think, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you. We move on to Jonathan Sanders. Knowing Jonathan and his sense of showmanship and looking up at the screen, I would invite the other panelists and myself to perhaps move to the audience so we can see the whole performance.
While you're moving, let me say that I'm thrilled to be here with Tom and Rose. When I first started reporting from Moscow in 1977, when I wasn't supposed to be reporting, the first story I did was the death of that great American, that hero of American culture and intellectual sophistication, Elvis Presley. And the reason I knew I was doing a good job was because some of the people that I went out and interviewed sound a little bit like the people Tom was reporting on. And virtually everything I know about the fall of the state system and the rise of capitalism I know from Rose's book. I also want to say, this is on the record, right? There is a tension between academics and journalists. Academics, like my friend Steve Cohn, love to point at the deficiencies of journalists and how bad the coverage has been. Beth Noble, who I write with, Beth and I just wrote a piece about Demovsky. I was helping her prepare those statistics about the decline in US bureaus in Moscow. Well, guess what? When I was at the Harriman Institute, we had 6 historians of Russia and the Soviet Union. How many do you have now? Where's the economic downturn that's had an impact here? It's not just journalists. Cold War. Which Cold War? That's what I want to know. Now, I'm a confused academic, so I only have something from yesterday. From yesterday. You know, I'm very glad to see that they got this new technology here. Obviously, they've taken the money that this immoral president of Columbia University was able to betray the trust of the Harriman family, sell Arden House, and buy this nice new equipment. And I say bravo to them. Which Cold War? When? Rose mentioned Mike McFaul, and I love that you got Mike McFaul confused with Jack Matlock. I only hope that Mikey does as good a job as Jack did. Who was the first correspondent from the United States and Russia? I'll give you a hint. He's also one of the first American diplomats there. John Quincy Adams. And I would suggest to you that there was a Cold War then, 1811. That if you read his letters and his wife's letters back home, the first correspondence, letters corresponding, it is a lot like Mike is facing now in Moscow. What Cold War? This is 2 days ago in Saratov. I'm glad I have the president of the International Dostoevsky Society to explain this to me. Which novel did Dostoevsky say 2 + 2 = 5 is also a good thing? Oh. Now, nothing's contained the Cold War on the people of the past, huh? Okay. Yeah. I've been doing this for a long time. At the high level, at the grassroots level, I showed you Vysotsky. For a long time, we kept busy covering people like this. What would a discussion of covering the Cold War be like without a pure Stalinist denunciation? Pure denunciation. Let me denounce Tuchev. Thank God he's dead. People use this as an explanatory framework for explaining Russia to Americans. It is garbage. It is wrong. It gets you in trouble. I think what we need to do is take something simpler. Instead of just relying on text, we need to think in pictures. After all, we know from Walter Lippmann that in dealing with foreign policy, people operate on pictures in their minds. I learned this from Marshall Schulman, not from some fancy journalism school. Thank God I never went to journalism school. This is the person I think we should take as our text for today, Margaret BourkeWhite. Margaret BourkeWhite was a multitasking, multi-tool journalist. She took photographs. She shot one of the first films about Russia. She was the test of the news. It's covering a crisis. How did the New York Times cover the 1917 revolution? Badly. She covered for CBS News the German invasion of Russia on radio with her husband, the famous journalist. Well, he was a writer, really. Erskine Caldwell. Erskine's mother said, "You write well, honey, but you have a lousy voice for radio." Look what she says. Russia was a lesson in patience. My experience as a correspondent and my experience as a student of correspondence is that the keys to successfully covering Russia and for allowing your insights to filter back so it's coverage by Russian journalists of Russia and the United States is patience, pictures, and people. The last big story I did was the Beslan slaughter, sanctioned by Mr. Putin, in which 366 people were killed, 186 children. How was I able, with the entire press corps of the world there, and the FSB, to scoop them and get the only tape shot inside the hostage situation by the terrorists themselves? I paid not a penny for it, despite what you hear in the Federal Assembly. People who like turning me down for visas think that I bribed someone. I did not, except with my personality. I spent 6 weeks sitting outside the hulk of the school just talking to people. And from one person, I met another person, who met another person, and I just asked. And the key to getting things done in Russia always has been your friends. Lennon was right. Not his Lennon, my Lennon. You get by with a little help from your friends. Margaret BourkeWhite went in 1931. Lovely pictures. This is called Butterfly Dance. You'll notice our great folk heroes, Stalin and Lennon there. They're still there. By the way, I think the police still hassle you. The last time I was in Vladikavkaz, in one day I managed to get stopped and arrested by the police 7 times. But police don't hassle you very much. Her patience got her this photograph. The Nazis attacking the Kremlin. Wasn't this what the central conflict of the 20th century was in large measure about? Cold War, hot war. She was interested in looking at a colorful machine. We've got a very colorful machine now. The machine's called Khodorkovsky. The machine's called Beeline. Margaret BourkeWhite went in 1931 for Fortune magazine, a business publication. She took this picture. Recognize her? Who is it? Stalin's mother. Think of what she gave us in the world. Anyone have an icon? Oh, is this flammable? Time is our most precious possession. When you're a broadcast journalist, time is effervescent. It's there, it's gone. It's there, it's gone. But you have to wait for things. She made these two remarkable movies that nobody has ever seen. And she came back. And she came back. And she came back. You have to stick with it. If there's a Cold War, you have to ask which Cold War. What are the limits? How are things changing? What don't we know? Eventually, through her friend, Harry Hopkins, she got to take this picture, which guess what? This is the only picture where you see Stalin had bad skin. Pochmarked. You know? Do you know how much you used to be able to get for a black market copy of this in the Volga? I got a complete set of Dostoevsky for that. CBS News opened its bureau in Moscow with the German attack. The bureau was closed down due to budget considerations and something called Stalinism, real Cold War, in the late 40s. Reopened in 55 with this man, Daniel Shore. Look at what Dan says, a reflection on the obsessive sense of secrecy and a lack of self-confidence. At one time, NTV was the freest, one of the best news organizations broadcasting in the world. Freer in their coverage of the war in Chechnya than CBS News had ever been in their coverage of Vietnam. Remember, the Smothers brothers were pushed off the air for their coverage of Vietnam. Yet a lack of self-confidence, a lack of openness, a desire for secrecy has propelled Mr. Putin, my official friend when I was on IREX, to do something different. Ask. Dan Shore kept asking every week, persistence, patience, and people, for an interview on Face the Nation. 1 hour. Face the Nation is just now going to an hour format. It's been a half hour since the 50s. They got an hour for Nikita Sergeyevich in 57. With a great deal of trepidation because they were afraid of McCarthyism and being seen as a tool of the communists. He went in and he interviewed for an hour straight Khrushchev. Khrushchev refused to put on makeup, said, "I'm not an actor." And it was pretty much, it was a sensation because it was an innovation, except for one line of text in the interview. When Dan Shore asked him about different interpretations of a Marxist doctrine about conflict in society as applied to China. And the Chinese had a different answer to conflict in Marxist terms than the Russians, Soviets. Harrison Salisbury, the great New York Times correspondent, who started out not being so great when he was first in Russia, picked up on it. And this was one of the big signals in the American press, 1957, that there was a coming conflict with China. And you remember, a conflict with China is what Andrei Amalrik talks about in his prophetic book, Will the Soviet Union Survive till 1984? And the answer was no. Another innovation on film, not in newspapers that you can read on microfilm, which is the preference of academics who don't spend enough time looking at popular culture and visual culture. It's just an anecdote about how much they ignore it. I started, before you came in this morning, playing Vysotsky. Not Volkov. I did 2 pieces on that. One, a 52-minute film in 1980 with Samuel Rathlin that was on PBS, Hiding Congress program. And I got Dan Rather to do a 60 minutes piece, 12 minutes on Vysotsky. I always thought that Vysotsky was a great key to understanding not the dissident culture, but the unofficial culture, the corrosive culture, the non-obedient culture, the non-conformist culture that went across social groups, across classes, across the Soviet Union. And I also thought that when rock and roll came into Russia in a big way, that was as effective. And I had some contacts with CBS Records, and somebody said to me, hey, you know anyone who's in the Soviet Union who might know rock and roll and be able to sing in English and do a record here? And I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I have a friend in Leningrad who could do that. His name was Boris Gravenchikov. So we signed Boris Gravenchikov to the first Western record contract in the mid-'80s, and of course Boris had to come here to cut the record, and of course he slept on my floor. And of course all my graduate students love this, especially the girls. And they said, Professor Sanders, can you bring Gravenchikov to play at the Christmas party at the Harriman Institute? I said, sure, no problem. Lots of chat. Boris will be glad to do that. So I brought Boris up, and he's playing. And an eminent senior political scientist who had a MacArthur Genius Prize came up to me and said, Sanders, what'd you bring the dirty hippie here for? This is the guy who was advising the President of the United States. So it's not just journalists who are ignorant. Marvin Cal started in the mid-'50s. He was a CBS correspondent. Was one of the last Morrow boys. Did a smart thing to prepare to go to Russia. He went to Harvard and studied with Marshall Schulman. Marvin had been a Russian major. Marvin wanted to show more than high politics, what was going on in the Kremlin, and more than Moscow. This was very hard to do in the mid-'60s. He spent a year planning a trip down the Volga. Controlled. His Gospel radio minder wouldn't let him out of sight. They went to a worker's house. Worker was not even a Stakhanovite, but happened to have a Volga car. Now, how many workers had cars in the 1960s? Does everyone live like you? Yes, everyone lives like you. By the way, my Gospel radio minder from the mid-'80s now works as an information officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Good training. Marvin did this hour. A Serbic commentary, beautiful footage of the Volga, visually stunning, intellectually, maybe not that revealing, but it showed a good deal of the countryside in Russia. We never got to see that. We didn't get to hear about it. Look what he says in January 1966. Bros, is it still inconclusive? Is the economic struggle still inconclusive? I called Marvin. I said, hey Marvin, I'm gonna quote you. Do you mind? I don't want to take you out of context. I hate taking people out of context. My job always is to call them up. I happen to have the great fortune of going to MGU with little Gaidar. You remember the last time Gaidar was here and he and I managed to get into a fight? The fight goes back years. And I'd call him up on the phone and I'd say, listen, you little fat fuck. I'm going to say this on national TV about you. What do you say? It helped that Stanislav Shatalin, his mentor, and was my friend. It's all about friends. It's how you get to know things. We put down the access that journalists had to Soviet officials. Daniel Shore said he had more access to Khrushchev after he did this interview than he had in the 8 years that he was covering that great Democrat, former president of Columbia University, Dwight David Eisenhower. A much better president than the jerk you have now. Finally, we did 2 hours primetime TV. this German kid, Matthäus Rust, landed in his plane. It's all about timing. Can you imagine? Can you imagine doing 2 hours on national television about Russia now? Nothing devoted to it? We don't care. If we cared, I'd still have a job. I want the Cold War to come back. Please come back. It was very good for business. We're going to do 2 hours. Significant resources, 1987. And all my bosses, and you should never listen to your bosses, at CBS said, can you get us an interview with Gorbachev? 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 Now, Gorbachev's a really interesting guy, although you can't do an interview with him because all he does is talk. I mean, he'll tell you what Gorbachev says, and then he'll tell you what Gorbachev thinks about what Gorbachev says, and then occasionally he'll tell you about Steve Covey. And, you know, that's a great thing. So I suggested heretically to them, I said, there's someone you haven't heard of. You've never heard of. His name's Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. I think he's a coming guy. I think he'd make a more interesting interview. I think he'd make great television. And they said, who? Sanders, you're out of your mind. How do you spell that? Yeltsin, E-Y, who, how? And of course, Boris had never done a national interview. Not on Russian TV, not on Soviet TV, not on American TV. And we had to follow him around to prove to him that we weren't wolves. Isn't that what Vysotsky said? Wolves? Who's the wolf? Who's the hunter? Well, we convinced him. And eventually, Yeltsin, one of the reasons he got chucked out of being party secretary for Moscow was building a cult of personality with foreign correspondents. And in these days, if you got thrown out of the Central Committee, you got thrown out of the Presidium, you got thrown out of the Politburo, there was no coming back. What, did you go to run a cement factory in Mongolia? Isn't that what happened to Molotov? I kept going to see Yeltsin. I kept going, I kept taking my friends. I made friends with his helpers, his cadre from ECAT, and guess what? When events started happening with an election to be president or a coup or something like that, his assistants, Naina Yosefna, Tanya, they remembered who was nice to them in bad times. And guess who had great sources? Did I know this? That this is how it's going to work out? No. Why did I do this? Because I trusted my intuition. I trusted learning from the poets like Tuchev. The good correspondent reporting from Russia internalizes the Tuchev maxim. He or she, and many of our best ones have been she's. Has Jill spoken yet? There's one of the best. That's one of the best. He or she learns this, what you can't explain, and uses it in dealing with people to make pictures that tell the stories in a Cold War to Americans so that Americans have pictures in their heads of people like that. And when they throw people like this out of power, this is the day he lost power. Artyom Borovik, killed under mysterious circumstances. My cameraman, Yuri, died because the healthcare system still stinks in Russia. And he couldn't get health care because some of the economic changes brought on by people who were advisors who came and went with pristine hands, like that bloody-handed criminal, Jeffrey Sachs. Things change. People change. It's people and pictures in your minds that are how we remember what went on. Cold War? What Cold War? The one that started in 1811, the one that started in 1917, the one that started at Yalta, the one that started with the destruction of Chechnya under Yeltsin, or maybe under Putin. Isn't there a Cold War now? Yeah. It's a Cold War against the people of Russia, carried on by the people in the Kremlin. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. As always, I have to get Tom and Rose, you better come back up here. As always, I have to say that I'm going to ask 2 questions, and the first one I prepared before your remarks. The second one I should have prepared before your remarks, but I forgot about it. The first one is about the fact that everybody on this panel, well, the 3 journalists here, I don't count myself, either teaches now or is considering teaching and has very close ties with academia. I, on the other hand, was someone who, at the time when it was rare, was, well, first a graduate student studying contemporary Soviet literature and culture, and then in 1987 moved from being a graduate student right in the middle of things to being a faculty member at this university.
I just don't want to look at Gorbachev anymore.
You don't want to look at Gorbachev? What happened to the Vysotsky? I thought we were going to have more music.
Well, we had Vysotsky before you came in, but we could put him back on.
You could put him back on. Anyway, I'm really sorry I missed that Christmas party, by the way.
Yeah.
I missed that Christmas party. I don't know how I managed to do that then. But anyway, on the one hand, I mean, I am incredibly grateful for the books by American correspondents. And as a matter of fact, I have to say that we had hoped to include also, we wanted an even bigger discussion of them, then we wouldn't have been able to hear as much from you. But Hedrick Smith and Bob Kaiser are both on deadline finishing their books that are due in the week. That'll remind some of you of 1974 when they were both writing, racing to get books out, which I used in my teaching. And I want to say that I was always very grateful for coverage, because if you were trying to teach contemporary Soviet culture, you needed journalism. And even with the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we started the course that Harriman students have to take, the Legacies course, scholarship couldn't keep up. I mean, we needed to go to news articles and still need to go to news articles. On the other hand, as someone, again, needing to get tenure and starting in 1987 and working on popular culture and Writers' Union disintegration and institutional disintegration along with literature, I found myself perilously close to doing things that academia considered journalism and which was
which is a dirty word, right?
Well, it was tricky. If you published it in the right places, you could get away with it. But I mean, there has been this interesting and I think very complicated synergy between academia and the press, where Russia is concerned. I don't know whether it's different. I would say, for instance, I do think that there is less of a tendency to come to experts now in academia than there was once on the part of the press. I think there, on the other hand, may be less reluctance to use press sources because there's a growing interest. By the way, Russian enrollments are really healthy here. I just want everybody to know. You've been hearing a lot of things about no interest. At this particular institution, there's a lot of interest.
Does that mean that the administration can make good on their promises to the Harrimans and have more faculty?
We do what we can, Jonathan. What can I say?
I feel like I came in the middle of something.
Okay, yes.
It's called betrayal.
Well, but Jonathan, we're on another panel, so, but anyway. So I guess what I'm asking you is to comment, as you answer each other, if you'd like to, if you would address that. The other issue is there is another correspondent I would have loved to have had here today, but he's really been out of the mix, but Rose knows him, I think all of you have known him at one point or another, and that's John Cohen, who was Time Magazine bureau chief during almost a decade, the Glasnost since 1995. He's no longer a journalist. But I remember he invited me to a conference on journalists covering Russia at Harvard, roughly around 86 or 87. And he was the only person in the room who had a master's in Russian studies from Columbia, and every other person had gone to journalism school. And there was a big discussion about how do you better prepare to be a journalist covering Russia, by being a regional specialist or by going to journalism school. And of course, the vast majority of people in the room said by going to journalism school. So I think, Jonathan opened that can of worms, so I think that might, all of you have more than paid your dues in learning about Russia in one way or another.
Some
and
of
I'd
us
say,
are still paying.
Yeah, many. Well, that was one of the reasons. There are different reasons some of you are teaching or considering it, and that's something you might also address. So I do want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions, but perhaps if we can throw that into the mix, and then we'll go about 7 minutes over because that's how late we started. So we've got about 20 minutes left in the panel. Okay. So.
I guess I can just say a few words about one of the good points that Kathy raised as to her perception that correspondents, including correspondents covering Russia, quote academics less than they used to. I think that's probably true. I hadn't really thought about it, but it is true. And I think the reason is not specifically about Russia, it's countries in general. The correspondent community has begun to, I think, develop a capability and a consciousness to penetrate more deeply into the actual people in the countries that they cover. I think correspondents have become more skilled, and I think that they are finding more people who they can easily contact. A lot of people in Russia and many other countries themselves are blogging, are creating user-generated content and so forth, and come forward and are visible and engage well with correspondence. So it's less covering countries as if they were something in a petri dish that we're all peering at. Journalists are much more involved in actual people and using fewer outside sources as a whole, unless there's some specific scientific information you need or something that's really specialized.
But I can't help saying, since Associated Press is one of the few places that really has a lot of foreign correspondents now, that might be, do you think that might be as specialized?
Well, that's true. I mean, a lot of organizations have reduced their foreign correspondent corps. They look to news agencies to protect them on things. So it's one of the things that we've had to do. We have to cover wide variety of things for a lot of people now that we didn't before.
Jill Doherty, Ann Garrels, Bridget Kendall, all superior correspondents covering Russia. Let's just take one. Bridget's now the diplomatic correspondent for the BBC, not exactly a doofus job. She had an undergraduate degree at Oxford, studied with Archie Brown. Liberal arts education, language skills, technical skills. Does anybody ask you if you know how to type? Does anybody ask you if you know Russian? How many Americans know a foreign language anyhow? Yeah, there are people who self-select out. Look at people who are going to cover China. Do experts get asked? I get asked a lot more now to comment on streaming video than I do about Russia. The only people who ask me to comment on Russia is when I do a thing, or I do a three-way thing frequently at the UN with the Inter-TASS bureau chief, my old pal from Pravda, Vladimir Kikilo, and Tom Graham. That's the only time people, the amount of time people spend talking about Russia. I'm glad I don't earn my nickel talking about Russia anymore.
Maybe it's partly an answer. The answer is how open the country is, because from my experience editing China articles for Business Week, Business Week quotes academic specialists inside China and outside China more than they quote academic specialists about Russia.
And the other side of it, that whether you like it or don't like it, that's a step forward, is look what our diplomatic corps did in making Mike McFaul the ambassador. That's, you know, that's a step forward.
Well, I think, unless you would like to address one another's comments, we will open the microphone to the audience. Please line up there, and please, even if you spoke yesterday, we are on tape, please identify yourself.
And who's ever here for the FBI, would you please identify yourself for me?
We should be so lucky, Jonathan.
Do you know that there was a CBS correspondent who was a spy for the Soviet Union named Winston Burdett, and that there was a CBS correspondent who was a spy for the FBI named Sam Jaffe? You know, when you read in the Soviet press that some of the correspondents are spies, it's true. Have you ever seen the Clark Gable 1940 or 41 movie, Comrade X, where Comrade X is a correspondent in Moscow who is a spy? And the movie begins with Clark Gable in his inimitable fashion saying, "Face it, baby, there ain't no news in Moscow."
Hello, I'm Dr. Mildred Polder of Cinema Verite, and I race here like crazy to hear Jonathan as well as the others. And you do not fail to entertain, as you usually do.
Thank you, Mildred.
Some information. I would like to make some comments. First of all, you may have made great friends in Russia, but I have a feeling you didn't make such great friends at Columbia. And I think that
I love Kathy.
He is here speaking today.
I'm here.
Well, I don't think Jeffrey Sachs is exactly crazy about you. It doesn't really matter. That's not the important thing that I was going to make.
Jeffrey Sachs should be chained to a tree in Siberia.
Oh, God.
And
it's nothing I haven't said to his face.
excuse me, well, my comment has absolutely nothing to do with Jeffrey Sachs, although it does have a lot to do with what's close to Siberia, including the Russian Far East where I have worked. I would just like to point out that I totally agree with you about pictures have 1,000 words, since I make documentary films, some narrated by Jack Matlock, your good friend, and the academics are basically not interested in it, which is very unfortunate because students absolutely love this. And my thesis is the reasons that academics are not interested in it is that they're pushed to publish all the time or perish, and since they can't make films, they pay no attention to them, which is truly tragic. Okay? My other point is my next film is going to be about the other Russia. Okay? The Russia that nobody talks about, including Sakhalin, where I work. Okay? Which should be discussed, because that is basic Russia. Now, that's a really tough one. And how do you get that across to the American public? So my question is, how do we talk about the other Russia? And I gave a terrific idea yesterday, which nobody on the panel picked up, because when I was last in Russia, I saw something that was truly exemplary. And I threw it at the panel, and I'm going to throw it at you, at this panel too, okay? Everybody knows what the orphanages are like in Russia. They are truly horrible, and I made a film called Mothers Wanted Abandoned Children of the former Soviet Union. However, when I was in one of these backwater towns, there was this old barn, and it was completely inhabited by orphans. And these orphans were working. And what were they working at? They had what was called an internet cafe, which is how I found them. Their internet cafe was in this old broken down barn that they slept in and they had fixed. But they were actually making money there. And they were making money because they knew how to work the computers, and they were becoming forward as major members of their particular town. And these are orphans that are normally discarded or become criminals or what have you. They were totally empowered, in addition to which some American had donated these computers. So they were real old computers, and you probably got some kind of tax deduction on it. But the old computers worked in their favor because they charged by the minute. And so you had to use a lot of minutes, and I, who paid in dollars, which was maybe an absolute cream, was heralded by this. So I asked yesterday's panel, has anybody heard of this? Because it handles certain things. It handles orphans. It handles criminals. It handles education. It handles empowerment. And I want to know, has anybody else heard of this? Any place I've been in, the Ukraine, I've been all over. Has anybody picked up on this idea? And what do you think of the idea? That's my question. And I hope there are other people in this audience that pick up on this idea. How to empower orphans and reduce the poverty, and they lived in this broken down shed and they loved it. Thank you.
Sasha, why don't you come and ask, because we have, and I see Naji getting up. Maybe you want to. Let's take a few questions together, Oh,
okay, that's on. So in this, my name is Sasha DeVogel. I'm a Harriman student. So I think at this conference, people have sort of lamented the demise of the old style of Russian coverage of correspondence, spending a lot of time there, and as Professor Sanders was saying, really get to know everyone. That's, make all those connections and friends with people. But that's sort of changed now, and it seems like Beth Noble yesterday talked about how many bureaus have closed down. I would speculate that it's unlikely that that trend would really reverse itself. So what do you see happening going forward if those kinds of relationships aren't possible, and if there's more of the parachute style of journalism? Where do we go from there?
Good morning. I'm Nadia Ashgikhina from Russia, Russian Union of Journalists and partly Moscow State University. I'm really appreciated for this session. I think it's one of the best joint master classes of international reporting and journalism as it should be, as I heard recently in one or two, several years. And I wish we could opportunity to show some fragments or probably the whole tape of it for young journalists here and there. And probably it would be really exciting to arrange a joint Russian-American summer school or some small seminar. And I wish it took place in Russia. It's really important because for Russian journalists it's important to know your position and to understand that it's important to be very deeply involved in culture of country you cover or just try to cover or plan to deal with. And some other journalist stuff, because journalism is challenged everywhere. And my question is now to probably Rose first. About economy. Did you cover corruption in Russian-American business? And do you think that corruption could make any obstacles for future Russian-American business programs? And what it's about coverage of this issue in the United States? I admire in your figures. I hope we'll get some similar figures about the United States, and probably results will be similar. But I hope we'll have those figures about representation of the United States in Russian media, which is not enough, definitely. And I think also it would be very important to ask ourselves and our members of McFaul and Surkov Commission of New Stage of Russian Partnership to plan something devoted to real exchange between professionals. Thank you.
And I think we'll make this the last question.
Yes, Professor Kent, what happened to these?
Please identify yourself.
Yeah, Bob Harris. These post-Khrushchev independent and professional journalists, and then, the media became so anemic in Russia. So what happened to these professional journalists, in the post-Khrushchev period? The second question is, so there seemed to be a bit of a contradiction here, and I didn't quite understand, is where did the government get information if the media was so anemic during the Soviet times? I mean, there has to be feedback that information has to come to the government from the media. I mean, and yet it seemed like the government was giving the press the information, you know. So I couldn't quite understand that.
Thank you.
Can I slip? I see one more person I want to slip in here. Identify yourself.
I'm Susan Human, and I'm an academic who went into helicopter journalism and worked for NBC. And I would think that the question right now between the importance of academics and helicopter journalism, or just sending people in on short stints, is interesting, but probably less important because so many people are working there and they're actually living there. So you have students that go there and do research, and they might be important, but I don't know how you see that. But I have to say that the helicopter journalism I did was the most exciting thing in my academic background. Was minimally important. My linguistic abilities were important, but the connections I had were really what mattered. But I'd be interested in your response to how we hope that coverage of other parts of the world and not just the insides of our Republican candidates becomes part of our lives again. And we're wondering how we can revive this and how you see the revival coming.
Well, I think that it's always a little dangerous to set out with an agenda in journalism. It leads to bad things, and that is why we don't set out to say, well, this year we shall, you know, write certain stories or take certain approaches, or and I think the Russia story is going to be a function of Russia as much as it is of anything else, rather than the decision made, you know, by news organizations per se that we shall increase coverage of Russia. It will depend on events, and if the story becomes the kind of story, you know, economically, politically, in the streets, that or culturally, that begins to attract more attention, and that in itself becomes more important and more visible, then I think coverage will follow. I think that, you know, when Russian movies become more popular in the United States, when Russia begins creating products that everyone buys in the United States, when political developments in Russia, when a candidate here says, gee, you know, they got a good idea in Russia, they do this and this, we should try that, then, you know, interest will grow organically. It's not something that we will set out to promote just as a goal in itself. And just to respond to a couple things that other people raised, I think I didn't mean to over-glamorize the professionalism of journalism under Khrushchev. It was more structured. Journalists were better trained, and they had a better sense that they were carrying out their official mission. Did not mean they all turned into Woodward and Bernstein and were, you know, tearing the Kremlin apart. That never happened, and it's something that is only a thought now for some journalists even today. And the last question that I wanted to respond to was how the government got information. It's an excellent question, since they couldn't get it out of the press, since they were writing the press. I think there were the main source of information was probably letters that people wrote to newspapers. For some incredible reason, Soviet citizens used to write hundreds of thousands of letters to newspapers. They never got printed. I don't know why they did, but it was considered a place to write and complain. And I think that that there was a lot of that information was gathered up and consolidated by state security bodies and political bodies, and did get to the top to some degree. But even that went through a choking process that I think was one of the biggest problems for the whole Soviet regime, that there was a tendency to report good news up, not bad news. So I think a lot of the discontent just never got to the attention of the leadership, or they never took it that seriously.
You want to go, Jonathan?
No, go.
Okay, to respond to the question about corruption, during my own period in the Soviet Union and Russia, the pace of the political economic story was so fast, and there was only me and one other sometimes correspondent, that we didn't get to do long investigative stories. We mainly wrote about, during my time, corruption as part of the business climate, and the idea that people had to pay protection money and that kind of thing as time went on, especially in the 1990s. Later on in Business Week's experience, there was a little bit more, there were a few more investigative stories, but that has never, to be honest, that has never been Business Week's strength. I think some other publications have done a much better job writing about corruption. But I think that's a very important issue, and it's more and more important as time goes on. To respond to the question of parachute journalism and how do you cover the world and all of that, even though the number of bureaus have decreased in Moscow, as Beth pointed out yesterday, certain bureaus have increased. And I don't work for Bloomberg Businessweek anymore, but Bloomberg has the largest bureau in Moscow right now, foreign bureau, American bureau anyways, in Moscow with about 20 people. And they cover various aspects of the economy, some of it very straightforward. Every once in a while, they do a big investigative piece on corruption. And also, there's this organization which maybe the journalists in the room know about called Global Post, which hires not extremely well-paid journalists on the ground, but they do help fill the gaps for publications that have shrunk their foreign bureaus. And in fact, Businessweek, before it was bought by Bloomberg, used Global Post after we closed our own bureau in 2005.
Corruption.
Jonathan, I am going to point out that the next panel is scheduled to start in 5 minutes, so I'm giving
Corruption in 1 minute.
Yeah, in 1 minute.
Dealt with corruption all the time. The nice man who was simultaneously, hi Colette. The nice man who was simultaneously working at the Kremlin and setting up Video International, which had a monopoly on commercials on television, wanted me to come join him. I said to him, I'm working for CBS News, we've got ethics. He said, oh, never mind that, you'll make a lot of money. Video International still is making a lot of money. I am not, and I am stupid. Television, we didn't do a lot of stories. Khodorkovsky did want me to come work for him, and I'm glad that Tuchev taught me to say no.
I think perhaps...
parachute, I got another minute for parachute journalism. This is Susan's question's a very good one. I'm now doing a 3-hour documentary for PBS. God help me. PBS, you only can watch it if you have a PhD or drive a Volvo. And they pay very little. So my university is subsidizing the cost of my journalism. I'm using a lot of cameramen and young people, some just graduated from Moscow State University, to do some of the footwork. We're doing an hour on Skolkovo and 2 hours on cybernetics in Russia. The parachute journalism question is a very interesting one, because we do have this breadth of knowledge and experience now, and with the lack of bureaus, it is easy to drop in and find someone who has been trained by, let's say, Internews, and work with them to go and do a story very quickly and very, very well. The other part is, with the advent of streaming video on the internet, documentaries are coming in a new form to new audiences. And one of the places that needs to be supporting investigative work are places with greater financial resources, financial lucidity, it's a nice word, including universities. So have some of your graduate students do videos and documentaries for their Harriman Institute certificate essays instead of these little pieces of paper that nobody ever reads, like mine that's still sitting on the shelf downstairs. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for being here.